I, 35 farads, never thought I'd be pouring my heart out to strangers on the internet about my family drama. But here I am, hoping that maybe someone out there can relate or offer some advice. It's a long story, so bear with me. It all started when I was 9 years old. My parents' divorce hit me like a ton of bricks. One day, we were this picture-perfect American family: mom, dad, my older brother, and me. We lived in a cozy suburban house, had family game nights every Friday, and took yearly vacations to Disney World. The next day, my dad was packing his bags and moving out. I remember standing in the doorway of my bedroom, watching him load up his car, feeling like my whole world was falling apart. I begged him not to go, clinging to his leg as he tried to leave. But in the end, he still left. I watched from my window as he drove away, not knowing that this was just the beginning of our family's unraveling. My mom didn't take the divorce well. At first, she was just sad, crying all the time. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of her sobs echoing through our suddenly too big house. But as weeks turned into months, that sadness turned into bitterness. And that's when she started poisoning my mind against my dad. "He abandoned us," she'd say, her voice dripping with venom. "He never really loved us. If he did, he wouldn't have left." I was young and impressionable. I soaked up every word like a sponge. My dad tried to maintain a relationship with me and my brother, but every time I saw him, I heard my mom's voice in my head. It made our visits awkward and tense. I remember one weekend visit shortly after the divorce. My dad had taken us to the park, trying to keep things normal. He pushed me on the swings, just like he used to, but instead of laughing and asking to go higher like I once would have, I sat there stiffly, barely moving. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "Nothing," I muttered. "I just don't want to swing." The hurt in his eyes was palpable, but I couldn't bring myself to care. In my young mind, he was the bad guy. He was the one who had destroyed our family. As time went on, these visits became less and less frequent. Sometimes my brother would go, but I'd refuse. I'd lock myself in my room, ignoring my dad's calls and texts. Each time, I told myself I was protecting myself from further hurt. But really, I was just building walls, cutting myself off from half of my family. Then, when I was 12, the bomb dropped. My dad was getting remarried. I remember the day he told me. We were at this little diner he used to take me to for milkshakes. It was our special place, one of the few connections we still had. He was smiling, excited even, as he broke the news, but all I felt was betrayal. "How could you?" I remember screaming at him, not caring that we were in a public place. "How could you replace Mom? Replace us?" The other diners turned to stare, but I didn't care. I was too consumed by my anger, my hurt. "Sweetie, it's not like that," my dad tried to explain. "I'm not replacing anyone. I'll always love you and your brother. You're my kids." But I wasn't listening. In my mind, this was the ultimate betrayal. He hadn't just left us. Now, he was creating a whole new family without us. "I hate you," I spat out, the words burning my throat. "I never want to see you again." I stormed out of the diner, ignoring his calls for me to come back. When I got home, my mom took one look at me and knew. "He told you, didn't he?" she said, her voice cold. When I nodded, she pulled me into a hug. "Oh, honey. I'm so sorry. I knew he'd hurt you like this. Men like him, they're all the same. They don't know how to love. Not really." Her words soothed me then, validating my anger and hurt. But looking back now, I can see how toxic they were. How they pushed me further away from my dad and deeper into this unhealthy dynamic with my mom. Meeting my stepmother for the first time was, well, it was a disaster. It happened a few weeks after that day at the diner. My dad had practically begged me to give her a chance. Against my better judgment, and much to my mom's dismay, I agreed. They picked me up from my mom's house. I remember standing on the porch, watching their car pull up. My dad got out first, then helped her out of the passenger side. She was younger than my mom, with long blonde hair and a friendly smile. I hated her instantly. She approached me, arms open for a hug. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said warmly. "Your dad has told me so much about you." I stepped back, avoiding her embrace. "That's funny," I said coldly. "He's never mentioned you." It was a lie, of course, but I saw the flash of hurt in her eyes and felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. My dad gave me a disappointed look, but I ignored it. The rest of the day was tense. We went to a local fair, my dad desperately trying to create some sense of family unity. He bought us cotton candy, tried to get us to play games together, but I refused to engage. I walked several steps behind them, arms crossed, scowling at anyone who looked our way. At one point, my stepmother tried to connect with me. We were waiting in line for the Ferris wheel, my dad having stepped away to take a phone call. "You know," she said gently, "I'm not trying to replace your mom. I know how much she means to you." I turned to her, my eyes blazing. "You're not my mom," I told her point blank. "And you never will be. So stop trying." The look on my dad's face when he returned and saw us standing in awkward silence. I can still see it when I close my eyes. Disappointment, hurt, and something else. Something that looked a lot like giving up. From that point on, my relationship with my dad and stepmother became a battleground. Every visit was filled with tension. I'd ignore my stepmother completely, speaking only to my dad. And even then, my responses were monosyllabic at best. My brother, 14M at the time, tried to talk some sense into me. "She's actually really nice," he'd say, "if you just give her a chance." But I didn't want to hear it. In my mind, liking my stepmother was a betrayal to my mom, and my mom had drilled it into me that we had to stick together against my dad and his new family. As I entered my teenage years, my rebellion kicked into high gear. I started acting out at school, getting into fights, skipping classes. My grades plummeted. At home, I was a nightmare. I'd slam doors, yell at my mom, sneak out at night. When I was at my dad's houses, which became less and less frequent, I made sure everyone was miserable. I remember one particularly bad weekend at my dad's. It was the summer I turned 16. I had been forced to come for a week-long visit, something about my dad wanting to reconnect. From the moment I arrived, I was determined to make everyone as miserable as I was. On the third day, my stepmother had asked me to clean my room. It wasn't an unreasonable request. The room was a disaster area, but I saw it as her trying to parent me, and I wasn't having it. "You're not my mother," I screamed at her. "You can't tell me what to do." My dad intervened, trying to calm the situation. "Honey, please," he said, his voice tired. "We're just asking you to tidy up a bit. This is your home too. We want you to be comfortable here." But his words only fueled my anger. "This isn't my home," I spat. "My home is with Mom. The only reason I'm here is because the court says I have to be." The hurt on his face was immediate and deep, but I was too far gone to care. In a fit of rage, I swept my arm across my dresser, sending everything crashing to the floor, including a small, antique clock that had belonged to my grandfather, my dad's prized possession. The sound of it shattering on the hardwood floor seemed to echo through the entire house. For a moment, everything went silent. I looked up to see my dad standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and disappointment. That was the last straw for him. He didn't yell. He didn't punish me. He just looked at me with those sad, tired eyes and said, "I think it's best if you go home to your mother." I left that day, and it would be years before I set foot in that houses again. As I waited for my mom to pick me up, sitting on the front porch with my hastily packed bag, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, certainly, but also a creeping sense of shame. A small voice in the back of my head whispered that I had gone too far this time, but I silenced it, burying it under layers of resentment and hurt. Looking back now, I can see how much pain I caused, how my actions tore my family apart. But at the time, all I could see was my own hurt, my own anger. I couldn't or wouldn't see how my behavior was affecting everyone around me. My relationship with my mom started to strain too. As I got older, I began to see the manipulation for what it was. The constant bad-mouthing of my dad. The way she'd use me as a weapon against him. But by then, the damage was done. I was estranged from my dad and stepmother, and my relationship with my mom was built on a foundation of shared bitterness. High school was a blur of rebellion and poor choices. I hung out with the wrong crowd, experimented with things I shouldn't have. My grades were in the toilet, and I was in danger of not graduating. My once bright future seemed to be slipping away, but I was too angry and hurt to care. My brother tried to reach out, to pull me back from the edge, but I pushed him away too. I remember one night, he caught me sneaking back into the house at 3 a.m., clearly drunk. "What are you doing?" he hissed, trying not to wake our mom. "You're throwing your life away. Can't you see that?" I laughed bitterly. "What life?" I slurred. "The one where half our family abandoned us, that life." He grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to look at him. "Dad didn't abandon us," he said firmly. "You pushed him away. And now you're pushing everyone else away too. When are you going to stop?" I shoved him off, stumbling towards my room. "Leave me alone," I mumbled. "You don't understand anything." But his words stuck with me, even through the haze of alcohol. It was the first time anyone had directly challenged my narrative, and it shook me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't until I was about to graduate high school that reality hit me like a freight train. I was 18, with no real plans for the future, a fractured family, and a trail of burnt bridges behind me. I remember sitting in my guidance counselor's office, staring at college brochures, and feeling completely lost. "Have you thought about where you want to apply?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. I shrugged, picking at a loose thread on my jeans. "Does it matter? It's not like I can afford college anyway." She looked at me with a mix of concern and determination. "There are options," she said. "Scholarships, financial aid, student loans. If you want to go to college, we can make it happen." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn things around. I threw myself into my college applications with a desperation I'd never felt before. It was my chance to escape, to start over. When the acceptance letters started coming in, I was ecstatic. But then came the reality check. How was I going to pay for this? I knew my mom couldn't afford it. And my dad, well, I hadn't spoken to him in years. I swallowed my pride and called him. The conversation was awkward, stilted. But when I told him about college, I heard something in his voice. Pride, maybe? Or relief. "That's great news," he said. "I'm proud of you." Those words hit me hard. When was the last time anyone had said they were proud of me? But then came the kicker. "About tuition," I started, but he cut me off. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy, "but I can't help you with that. Not until you get help. Real help." I was stunned, angry, but underneath that anger was a realization. He was right. I needed help. I'd been spiraling for years, and it was time to face my demons. So, I made a decision. I accepted a scholarship to a state school, took out some loans, and most importantly, I signed up for therapy through the university's counseling services. Those first few sessions were brutal. Facing the truth about myself, about my behavior, about the pain I'd caused. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As I worked through my issues in therapy, I threw myself into my studies. For the first time in years, I was excelling at something. I made friends, real friends, not the toxic relationships I'd had in high school. I joined clubs, took on leadership roles. Slowly, but surely, I was becoming someone I could be proud of. But there was still this gnawing emptiness inside me, a family-shaped hole that I didn't know how to fill. I'd burned so many bridges. Could they ever be rebuilt? That's where I find myself now. I'm 35, with a successful career, a loving fiance, 32M, and a life that looks pretty good on paper. But this family drama, this unresolved pain, it's still there, lurking beneath the surface. I've been thinking about reaching out to my dad, trying to make amends. But I'm terrified. What if it's too late? What if the damage I've done is irreparable? And then there's my mom. Our relationship is complicated. I love her, but I'm angry too. angry at her for the way she manipulated me, for turning me against my dad. But I know she was hurting too. How do I navigate that? My brother and I have reconnected over the years. He's been pushing me to try and mend fences with Dad. Life's too short for this, he keeps saying, and I know he's right. But knowing something and doing it are two very different things. So here I am, Reddit. A 35-year-old woman who still feels like that angry, hurt 9-year-old sometimes. I've come a long way, but I've still got so far to go. How do I even begin to fix this mess I've made? Is it even possible to rebuild these relationships after so many years? I'm getting married next year, and the thought of walking down the aisle without my dad there, it hurts more than I thought it would. But do I even have the right to ask him to be there after everything I've done? I guess what I'm really asking is it too late for a happy ending to this family drama, or am I just fooling myself? Update 1. I have been thinking a lot about my past lately, especially my teenage years. It's painful to look back on, but I think it's necessary if I want to move forward. I want to share what happened during one of the darkest periods of my life, when I was 17. That year, my rebellious behavior escalated to new heights. I barely showed up to school, and when I did, I was either sleeping through lectures or picking fights. I remember getting suspended for starting a fight in the cafeteria. Some girl made a comment about my family situation, and I lost it. When the school called home, my mom didn't even sound surprised, just tired. My grades plummeted. I used to be an honor roll student, believe it or not. But by that point, I was failing almost every class. My guidance counselor kept trying to schedule meetings with me, talking about how I was jeopardizing my future, but I couldn't bring myself to care. At home, things were just as bad. My mom and I could barely stand to be in the same room. Our conversations, if you could call them that, consisted mostly of her yelling and me slamming doors. My brother had pretty much given up on me at that point. He was in college then, and when he came home, he barely acknowledged my existence. As for my dad and stepmom, well, that's where things really went off the rails. It was supposed to be a routine weekend visit. I hadn't seen them in months, and honestly, I was only going because the court mandated it. From the moment I stepped into their house, the tension was palpable. My dad tried to make small talk, asking about school and my friends. I gave him one-word answers, making it clear I didn't want to be there. My stepmom, ever the peacemaker, suggested we all watch a movie together. As we sat in the living room, the silence broken only by the sound from the TV, I felt this rage building inside me. Why were they pretending everything was okay? Halfway through the movie, my stepmom asked me to help her in the kitchen. She wanted to bake cookies, some misguided attempt at bonding, I guess. I reluctantly followed her, if only to escape the awkwardness of sitting next to my dad. As she bustled around the kitchen, chattering about recipes and school, something in me snapped. I don't even remember what she said exactly, but suddenly I was screaming at her. "Stop it," I yelled. "Just stop pretending like you're my mom. You're not my family. You're the reason my real family fell apart." She looked shocked, hurt. "Sweetie, that's not true. Your dad and I," but I didn't let her finish. In a blind rage, I stormed out of the kitchen and up to my room. I could hear my dad calling after me, but I ignored him. I slammed the door so hard the walls shook. And that's when I saw it. Sitting on my dresser was this antique clock. It had belonged to my grandfather, my dad's dad. I remembered my dad telling me stories about it when I was little, how it had been passed down through generations. Without thinking, I grabbed the clock and hurled it against the wall with all my might. The sound of it shattering was oddly satisfying. For a moment, I felt powerful, like I had finally done something to hurt my dad the way he had hurt me. But that feeling didn't last long. My dad burst into the room, his face a mix of anger and disbelief, when he saw the broken clock on the floor. He didn't yell, he didn't punish me, he just looked at me with this profound sadness in his eyes and said, "I think it's time for you to go home." As I waited for my mom to pick me up, sitting on the front porch with my hastily packed bag, the reality of what I'd done started to sink in. I destroyed something irreplaceable, something that meant the world to my dad. And for what? To prove a point? To make him feel as bad as I did? The ride home with my mom was silent. I could tell she was angry, not at my dad this time, but at me. When we got home, she finally spoke. "I don't know what to do with you anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried everything. Maybe you should go live with your father full time." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mom, the one person who had always been on my side, was giving up on me too. That night, lying in bed, I felt more alone than ever. I'd pushed away everyone who cared about me. I'd burned every bridge, salted every field, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I was the problem. But admitting that meant facing a mountain of guilt and regret that I wasn't ready for. So instead, I did what I'd been doing for years. I buried those feelings deep down and let the anger take over. It was easier that way. Safer. Looking back now, I can see how much pain I caused, how my actions tore my family apart even further. I guess what I'm asking now is, how do I come back from this? Is it even possible to repair the damage I've done? Or did I go too far all those years ago? Update 2. Looking back at my college years, from where I am now, it's almost hard to believe how much has changed. After the disaster that was my high school experience, I wasn't sure I'd even make it to college. But somehow, I did. The first few weeks on campus were a whirlwind. It felt like a fresh start. A chance to be someone other than the angry, rebellious girl I'd been in high school. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. There was no one here who knew about my past, no one judging me based on the mistakes I'd made. But old habits die hard. As the novelty wore off and the stress of coursework began to pile up, I found myself slipping back into my old ways. I started skipping classes, staying up all night, partying, and pushing away anyone who tried to get close to me. It all came to a head about 2 months into the semester. I was failing 2 classes and on academic probation in another. My roommate had requested a transfer because she couldn't deal with my mood swings and late-night antics. I knew something had to change. That's when I decided to try the university's counseling services. It took me a week to work up the courage to make an appointment, but eventually, I found myself sitting in a small office, face to face with a counselor who would end up changing my life. Our first session was rough. I was defensive and sarcastic, but the counselor was patient. She didn't push, didn't judge, she just listened. And somehow, by the end of that hour, I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years. Over the next few months, we talked about everything: my parents' divorce, my relationships, my anger issues. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where I left feeling raw and exposed. But slowly, I started to understand myself better. One session, about 3 months in, stands out in my memory. The counselor asked me to talk about the incident with my dad's clock. As I recounted the story, I felt this wave of shame wash over me. For the first time, I truly saw my actions through someone else's eyes. I saw the hurt I'd caused, the relationships I damaged. "I'm a terrible person," I remember saying, tears streaming down my face. The counselor leaned forward. "You're not a terrible person," she said. "You're a person who's made some terrible choices, but the fact that you feel this remorse shows you're capable of change and growth." Those words hit me hard. For so long, I'd been defining myself by my worst actions, convinced that I was beyond redemption. But here was someone telling me that wasn't true, that I could be better. It was a turning point for me. As I continued with counseling, I also started to focus more on my studies. I'd always been smart, but for years, I'd used that intelligence to manipulate and hurt others. Now, I was channeling it into my coursework. I started attending all my classes, participating in discussions, and actually doing my assignments on time. To my surprise, I found that I loved learning. I declared a major in business administration and threw myself into my classes. For the first time in years, I was excelling at something positive. My grades improved dramatically, and I even made the dean's list in my second semester. As I focused on my studies and continued with therapy, I started to think more about my future career. I joined some business-oriented clubs on campus and secured an internship for the summer after my sophomore year. It felt good to have goals, to be working towards something. But while things were improving in my academic and personal life, my relationship with my family remained strained. I hadn't spoken to my dad since the clock incident, and conversations with my mom were still tense and awkward. My brother and I exchanged occasional texts, but that was about it. I knew I needed to make amends, but the thought of facing them, of confronting all the pain I'd caused, was terrifying. So I kept putting it off, telling myself I'd do it when I felt more stable, more sure of myself. By the time I graduated, I had a job lined up at a respectable firm, a solid GPA, and a group of close friends. On the surface, it looked like I had it all together. But there was still this gnawing emptiness inside me, a family-shaped hole that I didn't know how to fill. I invited my mom and brother to my graduation ceremony. They came, and it was okay. Awkward, but okay. We took some pictures, had a stilted lunch together, and then they left. My dad and stepmom weren't there. I hadn't invited them, and I told myself it was because I didn't want to make things uncomfortable for my mom. But deep down, I knew it was because I was too ashamed, too afraid to face them. As I stepped into the adult world, I felt like I was living a double life. On one hand, I was this successful young professional, climbing the corporate ladder and building a life for myself. On the other, I was still that scared, angry girl who had pushed away everyone who loved her. Now, at 35, I'm engaged to a wonderful man who knows about my past and loves me anyway. I have a successful career and a life that looks pretty good on paper, but I'm still struggling with how to make things right with my family. I've been thinking about reaching out to my dad, trying to make amends, but I'm terrified. What if it's too late? What if the damage I've done is irreparable? Update 3. Since college, my life has been a whirlwind of career growth and attempts at family reconciliation. At 35, I've achieved professional success, but personal relationships remain complex. After graduation, I threw myself into my career. Starting in entry-level marketing, I worked tirelessly. By 28, I'd climbed to management, finally feeling like a competent adult rather than a troubled kid. This newfound confidence led me to confront long-avoided family issues. It started with my brother's wedding announcement, making me realize how much I'd missed. We began rebuilding our relationship through regular calls. A year later, I finally called Dad. That first conversation was awkward, but we agreed to meet. Seeing him was surreal. He looked older, softer. We talked for hours, avoiding the past, but making a start. Over months, we slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't easy, but we were trying. Mom was trickier. Resentment from the divorce lingered, but I knew I needed to address it. Our first conversations were tense, filled with tears and accusations. It was painful but cathartic. Amidst this family reconciliation, I met my fiancé. Kind and understanding, he saw past my defenses. Our relationship progressed quickly to marriage talks. Wedding planning brought up unexpected issues. When my fiancé suggested asking our parents to contribute, I panicked. I hadn't told him much about my family history, especially the clock incident. I decided to talk to Dad about the clock. Over dinner, I broached the subjects. "Dad," I said, voice shaking, "I need to talk about the clock." Pain flashed across his face, but he nodded. I poured out my regret, shame, and apologies. Tearfully, I asked for forgiveness. The silence felt eternal. Then, Dad took my hand. "I forgave you long ago," he said softly. "I was waiting for you to forgive yourself." We both cried in the restaurant, years of tension dissolving. Dad insisted on contributing to the wedding, not out of obligation, but desire to move forward. Now, planning my wedding, I'm in a strange place. I'm happier than ever with my fiancé, but sad about lost family time. I'm focusing on building new memories rather than dwelling on past mistakes. As the wedding approaches, I'm filled with mixed emotions. Joy and excitement mingle with anxiety. Will our family progress hold under wedding stress? Can we truly create new, happier memories? Only time will tell. For now, I'm choosing hope. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that it's never too late for a new beginning.